The inheritance came with a single stipulation: spend one night alone in the house or lose everything to the state. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Bad news has always found me on Tuesdays. It came from an attorney's office in a town I had never heard of, in a county I had to look up on a map, and the return address had the faint, dried-out look of correspondence that had been sitting in a drawer for months before someone thought to mail it. My grandmother, a woman I had met exactly once when I was 4 years old, and whom my mother had stopped speaking about sometime around my 7th birthday, had died. And she had left me everything. The letter used that word specifically, everything. A farmhouse, 42 acres of land, a sealed bank account, and what the attorney described as personal effects of significant sentimental value. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time reading that word over and over. Everything. I need to tell you what my life looked like the week that letter arrived, because context is everything when we talk about why people make the choices they make. I had $1,100 in my checking account. My landlord had already sent the second notice, the kind with bold text and a number to call. I was 3 weeks out from losing the apartment, and I had already quietly calculated how long I could live out of my car before that became genuinely dangerous. I am not saying this for sympathy. I am saying it because greed is too simple a word for what I felt when I read the attorney's summary of the estate's assessed value. It wasn't greed. It was the specific, nauseating relief of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time finally seeing the surface of the water. The stipulation was buried in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd page, which I believe was intentional. My grandmother's attorney, a man named Harlan Deeds, who sounded on the phone exactly like someone named Harlan Deeds would sound, explained it to me in a voice that was carefully neutral. To claim the estate, I was required to spend one continuous night inside the farmhouse, alone, between the hours of sundown and sunrise. No guests, no early departure. Departure before sunrise would constitute abandonment of the claim, and the estate would revert in full to the county. He said there was precedent for this condition. I asked what he meant by precedent, and there was a pause. Not a long pause, but the kind that has weight to it, and he said only that the condition had been written into the deed for several generations. Several generations. I wrote that down. I drove up on a Friday afternoon in early November, which meant the light was already going by 4 o'clock and gone completely by 5. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel lane that hadn't been maintained in years. My car bottomed out twice on the approach, and the lane itself was so overhung with bare oak branches that driving it felt like passing through something's throat. The house itself was large by rural standards: 2 full stories, a wraparound porch, a cellar door set flush into the ground beside the foundation. It had been white once. The paint had gone the color of old teeth, and the window frames had warped away from the siding in places, leaving thin black gaps that the wind moved through. Standing in the driveway looking at it, I noticed that every single window was covered from the inside, not curtains. Something solid, boards or thick cloth so dark it read as boards in the failing light. Harlan Deeds had mailed me a key, a heavy iron one, the kind that belongs to a different century, and a handwritten list of instructions that I had assumed at first were standard property caretaking notes. Check the water shutoff. Don't run the upstairs bathroom tap more than 10 minutes or the pressure drops. Don't open the door at the end of the 2nd floor hallway. I had read that last one 3 times in the car on the drive up, and each time I had convinced myself I was misreading it. Don't open the door at the end of the 2nd floor hallway. It was written in the same neat, unremarkable handwriting as the water shutoff instruction, as though it were equally practical, as though it were a tip about the plumbing. I stood on the porch holding the key and the note in the same hand, and I thought, a rational person would get back in the car. I was rational, and I was also $1,100 from a very different kind of darkness than the one behind that door. The inside smelled the way places smell when no air has moved through them in years. Not rot exactly, but the ghost of rot, something that had passed through decay and come out the other side into a kind of dry, exhausted stillness. I set my bag down in the front hallway and stood there letting my eyes adjust. The walls were bare, not empty, but bare, as if things had been taken down, and the lighter rectangles of wallpaper left behind were the only evidence they'd existed. The furniture was covered in white drop cloths that had gone gray with dust. One of them, near what I took to be the sitting room entrance, had slipped partway off the piece beneath it, revealing the arm of a wooden chair, and, resting on that arm, a coffee mug. I walked to the mug. I picked it up. There was a ring of dried residue at the bottom. Tea or coffee, I couldn't tell. But the ring was inside the mug, not beneath it, which meant the mug had been placed here after the cloths went down. Someone had been inside this house after it was sealed. I am a practical person. I cataloged the fact of the mug, made note of it, and moved through the ground floor doing what I had told myself I would do, checking the structure, looking for signs of weather damage, understanding what I was inheriting. The kitchen had been stripped to the essentials: a cast-iron stove, a pump sink, a table with 2 chairs. A window above the sink had its covering nailed from the inside, and I noticed then that all the window coverings were nailed from the inside, not boarded up to protect against weather, nailed shut to prevent something from seeing in. Or, I corrected myself immediately, to prevent the glass from being a hazard. Old farmhouses, old glass. There were explanations. I built them carefully as I moved from room to room, the way you build a wall against something you don't want to look at directly. The staircase to the second floor was at the hallway's end, and I sat at the bottom of it for a while before I went up. The second floor had 4 doors. 3 of them opened easily onto ordinary rooms: a bedroom stripped to a bare mattress frame, a small bathroom with a cast-iron tub, a linen closet with empty shelves. The 4th door was at the end of the hall. The instructions had not told me why I shouldn't open it. They had not said the word danger. They had not said anything dramatic at all. Just that single, matter-of-fact line, the way you'd note that the 3rd step on a porch has a soft board. I stood in front of it for what felt like several minutes. The door was different from the others in one specific way. There was no keyhole. The others all had old skeleton key hardware, the kind that matches the iron key in my pocket. This door had been fitted, at some point, with a modern deadbolt, the kind you buy at a hardware store, shiny and cheap, and installed recently enough that the wood around it hadn't darkened to match. Someone had locked this door from the outside. I could see the latch. All I had to do was turn it. I did not open the door. I want to be clear about that. At least, not then. I went back downstairs. I made a camp of sorts in the sitting room, and I settled in to wait out the night the way I have waited out hard things before, methodically, without much feeling, making small tasks to fill the hours. I had brought supplies: a thermos of coffee, a good flashlight, a sleeping bag rated for temperatures I didn't expect to encounter inside a house. I arranged these things with the kind of deliberate calm that is, itself, a form of fear management. I had been in difficult places before. I had spent a night in my car in a parking garage once, after an eviction I hadn't fully anticipated, and I had learned then that the trick was to make the space yours as quickly as possible, to put your things down, to occupy the room, to refuse to let the unfamiliar stay unfamiliar. I was doing that. The house, for its part, was letting me. It was around 11 when I found the photograph. I had been looking through the kitchen drawers, out of boredom more than intention, and in the back of the drawer nearest the stove, beneath a collection of rubber bands that had all fused together over the years, I found a single photograph in a cracked plastic frame. It showed a woman standing on the farmhouse porch, this porch, recognizable by the post's shape, and she was young, maybe my age, and she was holding a piece of paper in both hands with the particular stiff formality of someone posing with a legal document. A deed, I thought. She was posing with a deed. Behind her, through the open front door, I could see the hallway I had walked through hours earlier. And in the hallway, very far back, almost lost in the photograph's grain, there was a shape that might have been a person standing in the dark at the base of the stairs. Might have been. I put the photograph on the kitchen table and left the room. I called Harlan Deeds at 11:43. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting a call at this hour. No one answers their phone at 11:43 on a Friday night on the second ring, unless they have been sitting with their phone close by. I asked him about the woman in the photograph. There was the weighted pause again, the same one from our first conversation, and then he told me that her name was Margaret, that she had been my grandmother's eldest sister, and that she had attempted to claim the estate herself some 30 years prior. I asked if she had succeeded. He said that Margaret had left before sunrise. I asked where she was now. He said that Margaret had never been, in his understanding, entirely right after that night, that she had spent the last decade of her life in a care facility outside of town and had died there 4 years ago, convinced that something had followed her home from the farmhouse and was waiting, always waiting, just outside whatever room she was in. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat with what Harlan had told me for a long time. Margaret had left. Margaret had left before sunrise. The will's stipulation suddenly read differently to me, not as an eccentric inheritance condition, but as a test. Not are you willing, but are you capable? And underneath that, capable of what, exactly? What was it that Margaret had encountered in this house that had sent her running before dawn, and then spent the next 30 years following her through her waking hours? I am a person who has survived several things that were supposed to break me and didn't, and I have learned that the word survival is often misused, that surviving something is not the same as walking away from it cleanly. You carry it. It changes the shape of the space you occupy. Margaret had survived the house, and the house had come with her, and the question I was now sitting with was whether that outcome was the house's intention all along, whether leaving was the trap, not the escape. The sound started at 12:40, not a dramatic sound, nothing cinematic, no creak of a floorboard or rattle of a chain. What I heard was breathing, slow, even, completely calm breathing, coming from the ceiling directly above me, which placed it on the second floor, which placed it in or around the hallway. I sat very still and listened for a long time to make sure I was hearing what I thought I was hearing. You can convince yourself of sounds in old houses: pipe expansion, settling wood, the acoustics of empty rooms doing strange things with wind that's found a gap somewhere. I know this. I cycled through every rational explanation I could generate, and I kept arriving back at the same description. Slow, even, completely calm breathing. Whatever it was not alarmed. Whatever it was, it knew exactly where it was, and it was not in any hurry. I went upstairs. I am aware that this is the part of the story where a reasonable listener wants to shout at me, and I understand that impulse completely. But you have to understand the arithmetic of my situation. $1,100, 3 weeks, the cold geometry of what came after. I had come too far, both that night and in the months before it, to be driven back down the stairs by a sound I couldn't identify. I climbed the stairs with the flashlight in my left hand and the iron key in my right, not because I thought the key would help me, but because it was heavy, and heavy things are a comfort. The hallway was empty when I reached the top. All 4 doors were exactly as I had left them. The breathing had stopped, and the deadbolt on the 4th door, the modern one, the cheap hardware store one, was open. Not ajar, not unlocked. Open, the latch retracted fully, the door resting against the frame on nothing but gravity. I pushed the door open. The room behind it was a bedroom, smaller than the others, and it was not empty. Along the left wall there were 14 canvases stacked face out, each one a painting. The same painting, repeated with small variations. A farmhouse, this farmhouse, rendered from the perspective of the driveway, at dusk, every window lit from within. In the first painting, the windows glowed uniformly. In the second, 1 window was dark. In the third, 2. And so on, in sequence, until the 14th canvas, in which every window was black and the house was unlit, but the front door stood open, and standing in the open doorway was a figure that was too dark to be a shadow and too still to be anything that breathed. I stood in front of that final canvas for a long time. Then I noticed what was on the easel in the room's center, facing away from the door. A 15th canvas, blank, primed white, with a single wet brushstroke along its bottom edge, fresh enough that it had not dried. I did not sleep that night. I went back downstairs and I sat in my sleeping bag with my back against the wall farthest from the staircase, and I kept the lantern burning until it ran low on fuel at around 4 in the morning, at which point I switched to the flashlight. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the 14 canvases and the 15 years implied by their sequence. If each represented a year, the first was painted 30 years ago, which was approximately when Margaret had stayed here and left. I thought about who had been painting them in the years since. The house had been sealed, Harlan had told me. No one had been inside. Sealed was, apparently, a relative term. I thought about my grandmother, who had grown old in a house elsewhere, who had kept this farmhouse sealed and unvisited for 30 years, and who had still left it to a member of the family, left it with a condition that guaranteed someone would spend the night here, that guaranteed the sequence would have an opportunity to continue. Dawn came at 6:42. I know the exact time because I watched the minute change on my phone. The light that came through the gaps in the window coverings was the first light I had seen in hours that wasn't my own, and I stood up and walked to the nearest window, and I pried at the edge of the covering, and I got a corner loose, and I looked outside at the empty driveway, and the gray field beyond it, and the bare oaks still and cold in the morning, and it was the most beautiful thing I had looked at in a long time. I had done it. Sundown to sunrise. I had stayed. Whatever the house had wanted from the night, I had kept enough of myself to make it to the other side. I collected my things slowly and deliberately. I put my sleeping bag back in its sack. I rinsed my thermos in the kitchen sink. I walked to the front door and I put my hand on the knob and I turned it. The door did not open. I want to be precise here, because I have had a long time to replay this moment, and I need you to understand that it was not stuck. The knob turned freely, the latch retracted. I could feel the mechanism doing everything it was supposed to do. But the door did not move. It remained flush in its frame, as though it were part of the wall, as though the hinges and the latch were decorative, as though the concept of this particular door opening were a suggestion the house had already decided not to honor. I stepped back. I tried again. I went to the kitchen and tried the back door. The window over the sink. I tore the covering completely off and tried to push the sash up, and the sash moved a half-inch and stopped. I went from room to room. I tried every exit I could identify, and in every case the result was the same. The mechanism worked, but the exit did not. I found the logbook on the 3rd hour of the morning, when I had already tried every door and window twice and had moved on to checking the cellar. The cellar door from inside was in a closet off the kitchen, a hatch in the floor that opened onto a wooden staircase. I had avoided the cellar the night before, for the simple reason that there is a hierarchy of dread and cellars occupy a specific rung on it that I had not felt prepared to visit in the dark. In the gray daylight leaking through the half-inch sash gaps, it felt survivable. I went down. Along the left wall of the cellar, on a wooden shelf between 2 rusted paint cans, was a composition notebook with a blue cover, the kind sold in drugstores for 99 cents. On the cover, in the same neat handwriting as Harlan's instruction sheet, were the words, "For whoever stays." I took it off the shelf. I opened it. There were 42 pages of handwriting inside. My grandmother had written the logbook. I recognized her handwriting from the instruction sheet, and the voice in the pages was hers. Practical, spare, without apology. She explained, across those 42 pages, what the house was. Not in supernatural terms. She was not a woman who used that vocabulary, but in observational ones. She had spent one night here herself, 40 years ago, under the same condition, and she had discovered the same thing I had discovered. You could not leave before the house was done with you. She did not know what done looked like. She had stayed for 3 days before the doors opened. In those 3 days, she had learned several things, and she had written them down for whoever came after her, because that was the kind of woman she was. She had suffered something she couldn't explain, and her immediate response was to make it survivable for someone else. I sat on the cellar floor and I read every page. The logbook said the house had a debt. My grandmother could not say whose debt or when it had been incurred. The property records went back to a land transfer in the 1880s that she had never been able to fully trace. But the house behaved, she wrote, as though something was owed to it, and it had a very long memory about collecting. She did not elaborate on what it collected. What she wrote was this: "It will show you things. Some of them are true. Some of them are tests." The difference between the women who walked out and the ones who didn't was not bravery, and it was not strength. It was the willingness to sit with what you saw and not run from it and not break trying to disprove it. She wrote, "The house does not want to hurt you. It wants to be witnessed." I read that line 4 times. I thought about the canvases upstairs, the house keeping its own record, the 15th canvas, primed and waiting. I went back upstairs. I went to the room with the canvases. I stood in front of the easel with the 15th canvas and the wet brushstroke, and I looked at it for a long time, and then I understood what the brushstroke was: a horizon line, the beginning of a composition. The house, or whatever occupied it, had started painting the next canvas in the sequence, and it had stopped, had left it for me. I found the brushes in a cup on the shelf beside the easel. I found the paints in a wooden box beneath the shelf. My grandmother had not mentioned this part, which told me that her experience had been different, that the house had shown her other things, had asked something else of her. The debt expressed itself differently each time. This was what it was asking of me. I sat down on the low stool in front of the easel. I picked up a brush, and I began to paint the farmhouse the way I had seen it the previous evening, coming up the gravel lane, the light going, every window dark. I painted for 6 hours. I don't know how to paint, I should say that clearly. I had no training, no aptitude that I was aware of. But my hand moved with a certainty that my hand usually reserves for things I know how to do. And when I stopped and looked at what had appeared on the canvas, it was the farmhouse exactly as I had seen it. The gravel lane, the bare oaks, the white paint gone the color of old teeth, the porch with its lantern, and every window dark. I had painted it correctly. Not skillfully. The perspective was slightly wrong. The brushwork was clumsy in the way a first attempt is always clumsy. But it was correct. It looked like the 14 before it in every way that mattered, which meant it looked like it had been made by the same hand that had made the others, which was impossible, because those 14 paintings represented 30 years, and I had been inside this house for less than 18 hours. I set the brush down, and I heard from the hallway the sound of a door closing. The front door of the farmhouse opened at 3:17 in the afternoon. I tried it on instinct, the way you try a door you've tried 100 times before, without real expectation. And it swung outward into the cold November air as easily as if it had never been anything but cooperative. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. The driveway was exactly as I had left it. My car was where I had parked it. The gravel lane ran back through the bare oaks toward the county road. Everything outside was as ordinary as the world gets. I picked up my bag and I walked across the threshold, and I stood on the porch and I looked back at the inside of the house, the hallway, the covered furniture in the sitting room, the staircase rising into the second floor. I thought about my grandmother spending 3 days in that house before the doors opened. I thought about Margaret, who had run before dawn and carried the house with her for the rest of her life. I thought about which of those outcomes I was heading toward. I have lived in the farmhouse for 7 months now. I want to be precise about that too, because I've noticed people assume the ending of a story like this must be departure, that the correct conclusion is escape, the door finally opening and the car driving away and the house receding in the rearview mirror. But I claimed the inheritance. That was the whole point. Harlan processed the deed transfer within the week, and by the end of November I had moved what remained of my apartment into the farmhouse and begun the work of learning what I had been left. The house has not kept me again since that first night. The doors open freely. The windows open freely. Whatever the debt demanded, one night of witnessing appears to have been sufficient for now. I hold the word now carefully because I don't know what the next air condition looks like, or if there will be one, or who the house will call next. What I know is that there is a 16th canvas on the easel in the upstairs room. I have not started it yet. I am not sure I am supposed to. The logbook had one final entry that I haven't mentioned. It was on the last page, written in a different ink than the rest, which told me it had been added at a different time, written later, after the initial 3-day stay, perhaps after my grandmother had returned home and had time to think about what she had learned. It said, "The house is not the haunting. The house is the record. Something happened here, a long time ago, and the debt is not payable. It is only serviceable. You cannot settle it. You can only tend it. And there is a difference," she wrote, "between being trapped and being the keeper." I have thought about that distinction every day for 7 months. I'm not sure she was right. I am not sure the distinction is as clean as she wanted it to be. But I am still here. And the canvases are accumulating. And on some mornings, when the light comes through the windows at the right angle, the farmhouse looks almost like a place someone could live. If the house finally let you go, would you have stayed anyway?